And I just got to remember how oh, got it. And I got to share my screen. Sorry, give me 1 sec here. All right. Sorry. Excellent. All right. Good evening, everyone. Hope you're all having a great day. And at least it's Friday. Yay. I'm Gabby from the Clean Air Partnership. The Clean Air Partnership is a charitable environmental organization, and we work with municipalities all across Ontario to help them increase the ambition and implementation of their climate action plans. That's our main modus operandi. And the way we go about doing it is just as each municipality undertakes a clean air climate change action, we get them to share what they've done with all the other municipalities. And then we ask, okay, if one of you can do it, what would stop all of you from doing it? And then we kind of bring the collective brain power together to identify the issues, the research that we need to do, and then pool resources to do that collectively rather than duplicating across municipalities. And one of the actions that we've been working on collectively over the last decade is green development standards. And so I really wanted to kind of give you a little bit of a sense of what green development standards are, why they matter, what do they do, and then I'll call out for talking about the risk associated with Bill 23 and green development standard authorities, but also kind of wanting to kind of identify other doors. With one door closing, if this one closes, I'm just saying, if this one closes, then there's other doors. We got to think about how do we kind of advance this action, and it's not like it's not like there aren't other options. So I did want to kind of highlight that on that one. On the conservation authorities and the land kind of thing, again, I think that there's some options. I'd love to kind of throw out some ideas and see what other kind of brainstorming of some ideas on this one, because I can assure you on this one, this is going to be a quite a challenge to try and stop this ship. And I think like the province has definitely come guns a-blazing from municipal authorities on this. And yeah, I'm quite shocked. I didn't expect this, but you know, live and learn. So and then of course this is it. They govern at the pleasure of Ontarians, and so transparency on the work taking place and the implications coming forward is also one of the things, because you can't. Transparency is one of the most powerful tools out there available to us to help drive the importance of these actions and the importance of not having these backroom deals for land grabs such as this. So on this note, let's go back to green development standards. So green development standards, they're standards implemented by municipalities to really advance the sustainable community, the sustainable design of their communities. And really when it comes down to it, it's not like municipalities have been doing this work for ages. They've always looked at kind of these like planning, not always, but in the last, all throughout our lives, they've been the one managing the site plan design of the communities and making sure that it's conducive with the neighborhoods and all that work, and advancing some of the kind of sustainability initiatives. And really what it comes down to it, yes, you'll get, like, it doesn't mean like you necessarily need green development standards. You'll get these little token developments that are greenier coming out. But this movement of all developments towards a certain advancement on sustainability is something that green development standards give municipalities the ability to advance. This isn't piecemeal. This is about kind of looking at it all across all developments within the community, and not just kind of trying to advance a few token greenie actions, which is what we did in the early 2000s as part of that. And green development standards starts changing the planning process to get everybody talking together about all of the sustainability metrics that we're all looking for in our communities and across across Ontario as a whole. So really what it's like. And one of the key things on this one is one of the important aspects of green development standards is they provide transparency to everyone. Everyone right from the beginning of the development application process can see exactly what the metrics are that the municipality and the community is seeking. Developers know it right from the get-go. They have the best chance at that point in time of incorporating as much as they can into their development, because it's this decision-making and planning is happening right from the beginning of the development application process. So I did want to kind of highlight on that. So what are green development standards? there are a whole bunch of different metrics that don't only look at energy. We do get caught up on the energy and GHG performance of the buildings, and that's definitely one of the metrics, but it's not the only one. There's things with regards to looking at it from the kind of community level, access to green space, access to transit, access to amenities, those types of things. And then there's also an element with regards to the green infrastructure. What's the depth of the soil that's going to be requirement? We've learned along the way that a lot of the developments in our past do not have the soil depth that they need to have to maintain a healthy canopy. And so that increasing soil depth has been recognized as one of the most important factors of maintaining and protecting the urban forest. How much precipitation is going to get dealt with on site rather than going to the stormwater system? How much active transportation infrastructure is going to be available for folks? Is it going to be bird-friendly design? So there's a whole bunch of different metrics that are part of green development standards. Energy and GHG performance is absolutely one of them, but it's not the only one. So why does municipality need green development standards? Well, it used to be that municipalities, one of the strongest authorities municipalities had was with regards to new development. How is new development going to kind of take place across their communities? That was one of the few areas of authorities municipalities had to be able to advance their environmental and climate change goals. And so as climate emergencies are being declared all over the world, as our population is growing, we know it's absolutely critical that we go as close to net zero emission buildings as quickly as possible. And if we, and not delaying on this and building the market transformation and the labor transformation that's needed to move us in this direction. And if we don't start planning for that now, we know that it's not just going to happen organically by 2030 or 2035. This takes a huge amount of collective effort across a whole bunch of different sectors. And municipal green development standards are a mechanism municipalities have been moving to help to move the market in that direction. And they're one of the few powerful tools that was available to them. So yeah. So obviously GHG emissions, buildings account for one. This is from Ontario perspective, but that's the minimum probably within any of your communities of 21%. It goes from anywhere from 21% all the way up to 56%, I think, in Toronto. But it's a significant chunk of the pie of our greenhouse gas emissions. And if we don't address the building sector, there's not a chance that we can ever achieve our GHG reduction targets. So addressing decarbonization and the energy efficiency in our buildings is absolutely critical. And yes, existing buildings are a huge beast that are going to have to be handled on this one. But we know that every building that is built now will have to be retrofitted within 10 to 15 years to meet that GHG standard. And it seems so ridiculous that we would actually just maintain the Ontario Building Code and not help move the market towards where they need to be going and ensuring that kind of innovation is taking place on an ongoing basis. And that municipal green development standards have helped to drive that innovation within the development building community. So really, what I said, the value proposition for this all, they're integrating the standards and requirements all into one place, creates transparency for everyone so they know exactly what the metrics are going to be and what they're desired right from the beginning of the application process, giving them maximum chances to incorporate it into their development. And it really is one of the kind of opportunities to advance that local economic development and building that the low carbon building sector that we need to be able to address not only our new buildings, but existing buildings as a whole as well. And it's the most beautiful kind of bringing it all together: public health, climate change, energy transformation, clean tech, efficient resource use. It is one of those ones that brings a whole bunch of Venn diagrams together. So the tools for municipalities really comes down to the site plan controls. Yes, you're going to do an amendment to your official plan to authorize those kind of authorities, but it does come from, the authorities come from the Planning Act and Section 41 of the Planning Act. And that's really where it is. There's a powers for green development standards within the Municipal Act, and then they're enacted and implemented through the Planning Act. Municipalities need to make an official plan amendment to activate the green municipal standard authorities, and then it gets implemented through the development application process. So it's this Section 41 of the Planning Act that's one of the municipal authorities that allow these green development standards to take place. And it's the sustainable design that is the magic word in the legislation or the Planning Act that is in enabling green development standards. And the Bill 23 would remove everything relating to this one, just slash and burn that one. So that's something that that we don't want to have happen, because municipalities have very few actually authorities that can really kind of help move the market towards the transformation that we need. And this was one of them. And then the province comes and takes that away from the municipalities. It's one thing not to be able to have the help that municipalities need moving forward to be able to act on their climate change opportunities. It's a completely different thing to take away existing authorities that municipalities are using to advance their climate change mandates. So really what it came down to, it at a minimum, maintaining sustainable design in this section of the Planning Act was what would be required to continue on with the Green Development Standards authorities. Did want to highlight, again, this is not just green development standards for benefits for municipalities on this. It's for the benefit to the occupants of these buildings moving forward. They're more efficient homes. They're more resilient. They can actually address infrastructure costs if we do this right in terms of the increasing densification, increasing intensification, and using the maximum amount of existing infrastructure that we can. It kind of helps to bring together the connected communities and advance complete communities. It really helps with the resilience of buildings, because the more efficient a building is, in the event of the power disruption, the more efficient the building is and the better building envelope is, the longer you can shelter in place associated with that. So I did want to highlight, just going through it, some of the examples. There's a whole bunch of green development standards in play and a whole bunch of municipalities advancing green development standards at present too. Sorry. So Toronto Green Development Green Standard is one of those standards out there. It's a tiered progressive approach. The Whitby Green Standard also follows that tiered approach. So tier 1 is what's mandatory, and tier 2 and 3 are voluntaries tiers, but every 3 to 4 years, the Green Development Standard will get rid of the lower tier and move tier 1 into tier 2 into tier 1's position, and then so forth. So towards helping the market move towards the eventual destination where we all know we need to go, which is net zero emission buildings, so as close to net zero emission buildings as we can. So that's one of the examples. I did want to kind of give a little bit of the highlights on some of the green development metrics, because again, we often get caught up in the energy and GHG ones, but I did want to highlight EV charging is part of it with regards to solar readiness. So I did want to highlight a bunch of things as well. That's part of that. Did want to highlight, this is the tiered approach that many of the municipalities are using for their tiered, and this is the leading practice in green development standards thus far. So I did want to kind of highlight just an example of that, but I won't want to read it because I'd rather leave time for discussions on this one. The Whitby Green Standard is again used. I just wanted to highlight the Planning Act and Section 41 authorities, which have been removed as part of Bill 23. Did want to kind of highlight the resources that are provided to the development community to clearly identify the rationale for each of the metrics and how they will be demonstrated. These are the green development standards that are already in play in Ontario, and there's a number of 6 that are advancing green development standards as well within their communities. Markham and Brampton are the newest, most recent ones that have updated their green development standard, making the energy and GHG metric requirement. Before, it was an option that they could pick and the developers can pick and choose from. They recognized they weren't getting the uptake that they needed on their energy metric, and they moved towards a required metric. Halton Hills just upped the points on their green development on the energy metric within their building, recognizing again that the voluntary approach wasn't getting the uptake that they desired. So really, it is one of the few municipal authorities that are available for you to act on your climate change commitments and addressing the emissions from our building, and addressing the drive to move the market towards the most efficient, best buildings we can build. Recognizing that we want to make sure that it costs, and over the longer term, this will save the people who own these buildings money. There is a toolkit for everything you wanted to know about green development standards, but was afraid to ask. If you're interested in getting more information, I will throw the link in the chat, and I will stop sharing now and answer any questions people might have. And did I stop sharing? Steph, did I stop sharing?
You have not stopped sharing. I can see your screen.
Okay, what did I do? Oh, there it is. I see it now. Sorry, on the wrong screen. It is Friday after all. Sorry, I know that was super fast. I just wanted to be as efficient as possible with your Friday night.
Absolutely. That was super fast. But so is there any questions or comments from people? I know that at the Wednesday's event, we had about 100 people show up, and Phil talked, and then Diane Sachs talked, and then they asked for questions, and it was crickets. Not because people didn't care, but because the amount of information that they have to absorb in your brain to figure out how this actually applies to what you're talking about. And I guess, Gabby, my question would be, you know, how does this interact or interfere with municipalities' ability to create 15-minute communities?
I mean, I don't exactly know. It's such a complicated bill. Honestly, it is very, very kind of like, it's such an omnibus bill. It's very hard to wrap your head around on this one. Again, I'm not a planner, so I don't know other mechanisms that are available to municipalities to be able to advance some of the sustainability goals. I just know that the site plan authorities in section 41 was one of the best tools that municipalities were used, and those are being removed. I do not know some of the other backdoor routes that might be available for municipalities to maintain that identification towards the provincial growth plan and complete communities, which is in the growth plan and is, you know, the strategy. It's interesting. The growth plan was really like it's always been pitched as an environmental plan, and it is. It's absolutely an environmental plan, but more than anything, it's a financial sustainability plan, right? Like we didn't end up with this infrastructure deficit by accident. It happened because we made decisions of overbuilding, and then our property tax base was not able to maintain the resources, the financial resources it needed for the time when it eventually came to the time of rehabilitation of this infrastructure. And in every community, inevitably, you're going to have to rehabilitate your infrastructure. And that is going to have to be paid for from the property tax base. And if your property tax base isn't supporting that rehabilitation, you end up with an infrastructure deficit. That's part of what got us here. It's not the only reason. The feds in the province hog a fair amount of a lot more tax dollars than municipalities do, and that's definitely part of the problem too. But it's definitely, the overbuilding is definitely, and I really would love municipalities to move towards the direction where not only do they take the upfront capital costs of growth into consideration, but they also advance the comparison about different types of land use archetypes. What density do you need to maintain enough of a tax base to be able to pay for the rehabilitation of the infrastructure when it happens? So you can imagine you have smaller kind of income coming in from the more less dense communities, but a lot more infrastructure costs for those types of communities. And that sprawl development is one of the reasons why we have this infrastructure deficit we have.
Yeah, and Gabby, I guess one of the things that came out when we were looking at the official plans, it was looking at, I think Ottawa did a study and looked at the cost of infrastructure and how, I don't know, was it 6 times or 60 times? What's the number of?
It probably would have been 6 times higher. I can't, I know, but Ottawa and Halifax and Calgary are some of the leading municipalities on that analysis of looking not just at upfront capital associated with growth, but how do they maintain different land use archetypes, and how do they kind of pay their own way on that infrastructure for not only for servicing, which is one cost, but the bigger cost is the rehabilitation of that infrastructure.
Okay. Does anyone have any questions for Gabby before we go into Jeff? And then Gabby, hopefully you'll stay. And then what we can do is, I think people will have a better understanding of site plan control, and then we can spin it back to you as well.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Hi, Jeff Henry.
Good evening.
Good.
How are you, Steph?
Good.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to ask, while we are talking about this and listening to Jeff, and if a light bulb goes off from what you were listening to Gabby, again, type in the comments field. What we're hoping to do again is, it's about this event is not just about getting this information out there, but I'm hoping to pull bits and comments and sentences and video clips from tonight, put them in bits and pieces, put them on the open source Google Drive folder, and then be able to take, have clips that people can put in the newsletters or put on social media or put on their websites to make, these very complex issues and topics into little piecemeals that, is easy digestible by everyday people. Okay, Jeff, you want to introduce yourself? You're a new person now that you're not a counselor.
Well, I think you've retired me 11 days too early.
Oh, sorry about that.
But my last day is November 14th at 11:59 p.m. That's when the council cycle flips over and the new people take over and get to inherit whatever the heck Doug Ford is going to leave us with at the end of all of this. So you've asked me to talk a little bit about site plan control, but I think it's really important not to get too deep into the weeds. So I want to back up a little bit and just spend a little bit of time by way of context talking about the planning hierarchy, right? To sort of understand how planning has worked in Ontario, for good and for ill, and the changes that are going to come through this bill, and then we can get into some details around site plan control. So at the high level, the province guides development, where and how we grow, how our communities sort of exist and connect with other priorities around environment and climate change and culture and heritage through something called the Provincial Planning Policy Statement. The Provincial Policy Statement covers all corners of the province, and it's in very high-level language, providing direction around the things we're supposed to take into account when making decisions around development and how we plan communities, and everybody has to do it. Then you get a level of more higher-level regional planning that can happen on certain topics. So the growth plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe, Toronto and the municipalities around it inside the Greenbelt, as well as the ones just on the outside of the Greenbelt, are covered by that. That provides more specific policy direction around where and how we grow in these areas that are receiving a lot of growth, that have a lot of existing infrastructure, that have pressures, that have higher order transit, and are trying to integrate those to be able to think through how best to plan communities that get around in reasonable ways and accommodate a massive amount of the province's growth. And so there's more specific plans through plans like the Greater Golden Horseshoe, the growth plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe. You've got some Greenbelt plans and Niagara Escarpment plans that speak to those matters. And sometimes those overlap with other plans and create some complexity. Developers don't like complexity. This is part of the reason the province is looking to streamline things in ways that are unhelpful, but it's where that's coming from. And then after you've gone from the provincial policy statement down to, say, the growth plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe, if that's where you're at, then you end up in levels of either city or regional planning, depending on where you're at. In Toronto, it's Toronto, but if you're in Markham, it's York Region, and you get this element of regional planning, which we certainly have here where I am in the city of Waterloo, with the region of Waterloo on top of us. Doing planning. And Phil did a great job of covering why regional planning is good, to be able to parcel out where growth happens and to really think holistically about a broader area of how all the pieces fit together in the most efficient and effective way possible in compliance with those higher level plans, which requires we think about growth, about environment, about climate change, about culture, and about heritage in all that we're doing. And so those regional plans can speak to sort of mass transit inside those areas, can speak to where and how communities grow, which communities should be targets for growth, and whether or not more land that was farmland or other purposes is needed for urban development to be able to meet those targets and to plan in a holistic way. And then you get the local area official plans, which put a finer grain on that, take that direction from all those levels that are higher and look at the community and really get into a finer detail around, key nodes or corridors or places to get more density, to think about how you do mixed use developments, how you create 15-minute communities by planning neighborhoods in different ways and putting those regulations in place. And then you get down to zoning bylaws, and that's really what prescribes what you can do as of right if you follow all the rules with your individual properties, and what kinds of things you can build on them, and what kind of uses, what kind of activity can happen on them, and sort of how they're sort of oriented. So that's sort of the broader, hierarchy that you get. So if you're a landowner and you're trying to do something, you could be a homeowner trying to think about a granny suite or a secondary suite in your basement because you've got relatives, or you need some extra income and you want to provide more housing, or if you own a large amount of property and you're thinking of multi-story, multiple buildings because that's where you should be. These are things that you'd look to the zoning bylaw to figure out what you can do. You would then go ahead and sort of submit a development application into the municipality with, here's my idea and here's what I would do. Depending on what you were trying to do, you had different levels. If you're building you're trying to subdivide land to create a bunch of different new homes or townhouses, you're going through a subdivision planning process. And if you've got a parcel of land that's going to create a number of units, in our municipality it's 3 or more units, you're going through a site plan application before you can go and get your building permit to build. And so that's when we get to site plan control, that's really what we're talking about. We're underneath all of these layers of planning policy that are describing at finer and finer levels of detail what goes where and how it connects. And so when you finally get down to sort of site plan control, you're looking at very technical details about how a site is laid out, about where the parking might be located, where you're storing garbage, whether you've got a loading space, what some of the landscaping looks like around that property, and if you've got a building, what kind of cladding you're sort of putting on that to some degree, if you've got a green development standard, but and sort of massing and fit. And I can actually, I think it might be helpful if I actually pull up that section of the Planning Act just so people can see it, because we want to talk about it. Here's the site plan control section, and this is a track changes from one of the law firms that has sort of put the bill into this kind of format. And so 2 changes are happening with site plan. The first thing is if you're building 10 units or less, you don't have to do it anymore. Whereas municipalities could, if they chose, require that you do it. In Waterloo, it's 3 units or more. If you're doing residential and any sort of commercial retail, you have to go into site plan. But here they're saying 10 units or less, don't have to do it anymore. I'll speak to that in a moment. But the other thing that I think is useful to know is, what is it that you can ask of developers in site plan control? What does this mean to sort of people for how this works? And this starts by telling us, as long as we pass the right policies, we can require as a municipality that that you can only develop land if you do these things. And so we can require, what are you building where is what this sort of does. Show us some drawings that help us understand these different factors. The massing and conceptual design of the building. So, is it a slab? Is it one of these tower podium things? Is it all of that stuff you can look at through site plan, how it relates to the street. What's sort of going on inside for sort of, access issues to get in and out, if I was where the elevators or walkways or stairs, and how does that sort of get out to the street? Then this is the part Gabby was talking about. The sustainable design part is key to the green development standards that many municipalities, including ours, are pursuing, but now I guess won't be able to. But exterior design, character, scale, appearance, design features of the building. And then there are a few other matters that are sitting here. The important sort of factor here is that the way a municipality might, and this is the case in ours, look at how to assess this currently, is we might have urban design guidelines. We might have other forms of guidelines that we've got accessibility guidelines as well that we sort of apply to sort of developments that come through. And so that might, that sort of speaks to sort of character, scale, appearance, and design. Because while we're not allowed to regulate how a building is constructed, we are currently allowed to sort of speak to how it looks in that sort of way. And while we'll still be able to figure out how it's massed, right? One of the big building blocks of how a building sort of sits on the property, is it one long line or does it sort of articulate? We'll still be able to do that, but what it sort of looks like and how it fits in, that part disappears, is what's proposed. So what you think your urban design guidelines may require may not be able to require it anymore, I think is the key sort of message on here. And from the sort of 10 units or less, which I said I would go back to, and that's up here. I think I should speak to that a bit in more detail. That connects with some of the affordability pieces that we have. I think we heard in Phil's presentation a conversation that the province wanted the focus of their bill to be, we're bringing housing to your neighborhood. It's going to be overriding those NIMBYs, bringing that kind of density that we require to build 15-minute communities that work for everybody, and that accommodate the growth that we're going to have. And that's not what's actually happening here, but this is one of the potential triggers that could theoretically assist the sort of waiving of site plan control for 10 units or less, because the kind of buildings that have sort of 10 units or less tend to be those that might fit at the edges of neighborhoods, or that people like environmental defense and the broader movement were advocating were allowed to bring into existing neighborhoods, being able to build small apartments like we were doing until the 70s, to be able to have more neighbors that fit in with community. And so on the one hand, eliminating sort of site plan control as a tool for those small scale developments that could fit inside neighborhoods could make those easier to do. Could make it, if the municipality allowed them to be built, then it would make them easier to build and faster to build with sort of fewer regulations, cheaper to build, which might make the money work. So you would actually see people do it, because it's not onerous. It's one of those red tape things that I can understand. But on the other hand, convincing communities that you rezone neighborhoods to provide for small apartments was probably premised on selling folks that weren't quite NIMBYs, but weren't quite convinced that welcoming more neighbors was a good thing. Well, at least we can have some, impact on design so that it can fit into the existing character of neighborhoods. So I think the politics of building in more density, more gentle density in neighborhoods like we were doing in the 60s and 70s is going to be harder because of the elimination of the exterior design part, even as it's easier because of not requiring site plan for 10 units or less. So that's sort of part of the yin and yang of that will make it. It's what Phil was talking about them doing one thing, but then undoing it in a different breath when they're speaking to sort of the densification aspects of this bill. So that's sort of where the site plan control piece sits. Those are rarely public processes anyways, because it is a very technical exercise that staff go through, but they're based on these guidelines that communities might have come to expect in their neighborhoods, or certainly might need if you were going to be able to convince councils and neighborhoods to accept more density through zoning changes. So that's the first thing. The second thing, Steph, that you said I would talk about tonight is around municipal finances. I think Gabby was talking just a moment ago around what I would attribute to be life cycle cost of infrastructure, not just sort of the upfront capital cost. DCs, development charges, are what municipalities collect to be able to provide those upfront capital costs to support growth and growing communities. So whether that's new roads and new pipes to service those subdivisions that Doug Ford wants to build on the edges of cities, hours away from jobs and any amenities, those require new investment, and that comes today through municipalities through development charges. The same thing is true for infill intensification, because maybe the pipes need to be bigger, or certainly the community centers need to be larger. The libraries, you might need another branch. There are all sorts of services that growth requires no matter where it happens. It's more efficient in infill, but it needs to happen everywhere. And municipalities collect those through development charges. So one thing that this bill does is it it's a death of 1,000 paper cuts in terms of the ability to collect that growth, trying to pay for growth costs in several ways. The first way is it discounts it right off the top, that whatever you think you need to collect based on very detailed, complex, precise calculations that developers can challenge already if they think they're wrong, they can say, well, you get 20% off the first year, 15% off the second year, 10% off the third year, 5% off the fourth year. But if you're still around in the fifth year, then you'll finally pay what it costs. So where do those costs get made up for? Property taxes and user rates. It's the only mechanism that we'll have. So on average, over a 10-year time frame, that's a 5% haircut off the top. The second thing is they're trying to incent, I think that's trying to incent more housing now by making costs cheaper now. I think that's where that's coming from. The second one is trying to build more rental housing and incent that through development charges. I like that. That makes sense. We should be incenting rental housing. And in fact, the larger the rental unit, if you've got a 3-bed unit, you get the highest discount on development charges. I think that one's also on the order of 80%. The smaller units are 90%. And then when you build a regular rental unit, you get 5 or 10% off. So there's another discount there. And if we're getting 35% of all of our residential development being rental housing, well, there's another haircut that municipalities are taking. So the next one I'll come to is affordable housing. And the government wants to incent affordable housing. It may be rental, maybe ownership. They're defining it a little bit differently than we've traditionally done. It usually had multiple definitions, but now it's 80% of sort of the average market rent, or the average sort of price of units, as the province tells us, whatever that price is going to be, over at least 25 years. That's sort of that's the affordable housing definition on that. And if somebody is building it, or if they're a nonprofit, or if they're, then no development charges are applicable to you. But again, the costs still happen from growth, so that's 100% haircut on whatever gets built that's affordable. And the one that's sort of missing here is they now talk about waiving all development charges for attainable housing. Attainable is typically those folks in the income middle that are getting increasingly priced out in the current market situation. Attainable housing, generally not your $1 million single detached home, but maybe your $500,000 one-bedroom condo. That's sort of in an attainable kind of range. And we don't know what government thinks attainable is, because they said that they'll just write those in regulations. The definition of attainable is it's not affordable, and it's whatever we say it is later. So we don't actually know what attainable is going to mean, but that'll all be no development charges too, once they write the regulations. So if you add all of these pieces together, you end up taking off 5, 10, 15, 20% of what municipalities are expecting to be able to recover for growth costs, for capital costs, to build the infrastructure necessary for new housing and new jobs and new retail. And it'll have to be made up somewhere. It'll have to be made up through property taxes or user rates or the province. Now, the province has said that they are thinking about, well, maybe some of that federal money for affordable housing could flow through to you guys, and that would cover it. We don't know if the feds would say yes to that, but if the province is doing it, the province should really fund it. And if we go back 30, 40 years, the way we used to fund, growth and new infrastructure in communities was substantially through grants from the province. Like in the height of the baby boom, when we were expanding communities like nobody's business, the province funded a large percentage of public infrastructure expansion. All the stuff that's coming due and creating an infrastructure gap was a lot of it was built by the province to fund growth, because we didn't do development charges then. We moved to this mode, and so now we're expecting that money to come through development charges and growth. But if we're not allowed to collect it, it's got to come from the property tax base, from user rates, or from the province to make up the gap. So we'll see what can happen. We'll see what can happen there. And the other thing is, apparently people that live in affordable housing, or that live in units set aside for inclusionary zoning, and we can talk about that if people want, those folks don't need any parkland. They don't need these kinds of special amenities that everybody else needs. They don't generate a demand on parkland because we can't collect parkland dedication costs for those, or land in subdivisions to provide parks if there's affordable housing in it. Now, I understand that as a cost basis, but it means less revenue to be able to build the kind of amenities that create those wonderful communities you see on developers' billboards and ads that are actually generated based on these fees that get paid into municipalities. So all of those things create a lot of financial pressure for your municipalities who are already dealing with construction cost escalation and a population that really doesn't want to pay more for anything. So the cost of this bill is going to be substantially borne in local property tax rates and user rates by councils that get less say over everything that gets spent on. So that's sort of the high level romp, and I think I'll be happy to be directed by questions for other things folks are looking for.
Thanks, Jeff. A quick question from someone. It says, when Steve Clark was challenged about cutting development charges, he said municipalities have millions in reserve, implying that remove the shortfalls for the municipalities. Can you comment, please?
If we could swear, I have words about that. But I think he is dissembling. What's the parliamentary language for trying to not completely tell the truth on this? Do we have money in reserves? Of course we have money in reserves. They've been collected in accordance with development charge bylaws that very precisely make sure that it's $1 in, $1 out in terms of growth funding. So we have very complex calculations for how much growth is going to happen, and all the projects required to support that growth and the cost of those projects, and run through some math, and that spells out the cost per unit that people collect. We collect it over time because the infrastructure gets built over time. Some happens early, some happens late. And so you always have this flow through. And if you've collected money that's unspent, that's reduced from your next development charge bylaw. So over the life of a development charge bylaw, which is 10 or 15 years, depending on the infrastructure you're talking about, all the dollars in are allocated to infrastructure necessary to support that existing growth that's being planned. Any shortfall on that, because the province tells us we're not allowed to collect it, is a shortfall on the math to make those projects work. Let me give you an example in Waterloo. So we have, and this is typical in many places as you're building subdivisions, is in order to build the subdivision, you need to have a water pipe, you need to have a wastewater going in, wastewater pipes coming out. Sometimes you need pumping stations to be able to put poop under pressure to go over that hill over to the treatment plant, and stormwater pipes and ponds, and maybe road expansions to be able to support that new subdivision. And you have to build that as a municipality before people move into that subdivision, before you start collecting development charges on those houses. So for us, Beaver Creek is going to be the last major subdivision in Waterloo. That's a $70 million infrastructure project for us that we would have to start flowing money out for before people start moving in to pay it. So do we have some money sitting in reserves right now that we've been collecting from development charges that will pay for that? Yes. And it'll sit there until we build the thing. And we'll build the thing as soon as the local planning of the Ontario Land Tribunal gives us a decision on what the heck's happening with those 4 landowners that can't agree with decent planning up in that corner of the city. And then we'll spend it. And then we'll be in deficit. And we'll be in deficit on those accounts for the entire 15 years of the development charge bylaw, because it will take us until that's completed to recover all those dollars. So we got the money now, then we'll be in debt, and then we'll be back up. So is there money in reserves? Yes, but it's $1 in, $1 out for everything that's accounted for. And if developers don't agree with those projects, the funding, the calculations, the share for what's their portion and what somebody else's, they can challenge it before the OLT. So it's very well documented that those dollars are allocated. They're set for particular projects, and they'll be spent as you start seeing those communities rolled out, and the new dollars come in from the next set of growth that's being planned, because these are always sort of moving forward over time.
So Jeff, I have a question for you. I forgot about this, and it's twinging in my brain. I saw a number, and I don't know how it's changed from what is the rule now, but it stated that municipalities have to spend now 80% of the development fees they've collected that year by the end of that year, and they can't store it or reserve it.
So they've said spend or allocate.
Okay.
So the allocate is actually helpfully flexible. We just have to account for it going somewhere in our budget. I think that there is perhaps a concern in some places where there isn't a level of confidence. I don't want to say transparency, but confidence that municipalities will spend, these dollars for the projects that they say they will over a period of time. And so by saying allocate, it means that the actual budgets a municipality is approving, you will see a certain amount of those dollars being allocated. So for us, we're allocating Beaver Creek. We're always allocating it in sort of, the current year or the next year, because it could move as soon as the development permissions are sort of there and we've got the subdivision planning, we're ready to move on the project. But I ain't building a pumping station for a cornfield, right? That doesn't make any sense. So as soon as we're ready to go, we're ready to go. But we've got it allocated in the budget, and that would satisfy their criteria. But at least then you're seeing the projects on the books. Gotcha. And you're able to track that and have confidence. So I think that's what that part is.
Okay. So Gabby, can we pull you back in? I have the video recording right now that whoever's speaking shows up on the screen. So we might have some random in the recording. It might be, quick switching between everyone. But looking at, do people want to raise their hands? I'm looking in the chat window, and I think I've missed some of the questions by people. If people want to raise their hands or they just want to speak up, we're very casual here, guys. It's not an official webinar or anything like that. Please speak up. This is about giving you space and time to reflect and ask the questions that you need to better understand this content, so that you can bring it back to the organizations and groups and people that you're connected with, so we can mobilize quicker and better. So I'm going to quickly kind of go back in the chat to see if I can find some of the questions. Or Gabby, you saw one?
Questions that I did respond to in the chat, which was about, does that mean that Green Development Standards authorities are toast? And if they are, they're not toast. They're not toast yet. The bill hasn't passed, even though they are accelerating this through the legislature super fast. But one of the key things, there is momentum taking place, and that's one of the key things. That TAF letter, the link I put to the TAF letter, signing on to that letter is really, really important, and send that message about maintaining. Like, this is, again, I understand there's huge amounts in this bill. It is way too hard for anyone to wrap their heads around in a normal time period of the bill passing, never mind this accelerated run through the legislature. But it's not. Not all hope is lost after this. There is authorities, and in the Municipal Act, in the City of Toronto Act, called the climate, that are referred to as climate change bylaws. They were added to the Municipal Act and the City of Toronto Act in 2018, if I remember correctly, something like that. I can't remember the exact year, maybe, but and municipalities haven't been using them just as yet. Largely because it's kind of vague about what a climate change bylaw can or cannot be, but that vagueness really seems to be in the hands of municipalities to be able to decide what they want to use their climate change bylaw authorities for. So there is that as an opportunity for municipalities to take a leadership role and start enacting those authorities, if the province insists on taking the sustainable design authorities and so many other ones out. So that's another route that municipalities can use to advance their climate and sustainability actions and priorities.
And I'd add, Gabby, to that, just because you talked about how green development standards aren't just about the building. And losing the building is very important to all of this, because it was the only sort of workaround to not having a higher standard than the Ontario Building Code. So really the answer is, since the Ontario Building Code update is still under sort of a consultation regime, the last draft isn't out yet, we can tell them, forget all these, if you don't want these green development standards piecemeal across the province, set one that's reasonable across the province. Even if it's a little bit less than what Toronto's doing now, great if it's for everybody. Right. And so I think there's an angle there.
And that's what that's the process that happened in BC when they started advancing their BC STEP code. It was the kind of like development community. The province took on a position, a leadership position of bringing together the development communities, the home builders, the NGOs, the municipalities, all coming together to advance the BC Step Code. There's now improvements. I would like to call it BC Step Code version 2.0, which is finally bringing in GHG emissions into their metrics as well. So I would love to kind of like, if that's the direction that they're going to go, if they're going to remove green standards authorities, I think there's a real good push for getting that collective action, because right now there's no improvements planned for the Ontario Building Code on energy efficiency. In addition, there is absolutely no mention of GHG emissions or any performance standards on GHG emissions in the Ontario Building Code. So if they don't want green standards or don't want green standards going in and interfering with the energy requirements, then advance and make the Ontario Building Code the leading edge policy that it can and should be across the province.
Yeah, thanks, Gabby. I have a question in the comment. Could Jeff comment on the timing of this bill at a time of major transition in municipal governance? How do you feel about that, Jeff?
It's politically strategic on behalf of the government to drop it the day after a municipal election and try to pass it before new municipal councils take office. It means almost nobody's sitting in any council meetings, almost nobody's sort of sitting around a table doing the municipal pressure that would normally come on this, because everybody's sort of doing a handoff and orientation and nobody's ready to say anything. Because if this happened at any other time, I can tell you in the region of Waterloo, most of us would be saying, dear God, don't dismantle regional planning. The countryside line and protected countryside has come from a coordinated effort led through the region to be able to protect, to hold the line on where we're growing, hold the line on farmland, hold the line on where our water recharge comes from, and to be able to do, to build in a smart way, in the right places and in the right way, to build that community. Whereas what this is going to do is leave it to all the individual municipalities to set that line. Over time, it's going to blur. It's not going to be contiguous. The policies aren't going to be the same. We're all going to be with our own expertise, and it's going to be much harder for the environmental advocates in the community that have done so well to do so well when there's so many more people you have to actually write plans through, and staffs, particularly in the townships, that just don't exist with the kind of capacity to be able to lead on environmental models. The timing is trying to eliminate municipal opposition to this, because municipal opposition is disorganized and in transition.
Thanks, Jeff. Another question. I'm sure Gabby can't necessarily answer this, and Jeff, do you use a councillor? I know this isn't really talking about control standards or green development standards. It's talking about homelessness and the big issue of, and we're just going to jump into this very slightly, because I know you're not the expert on affordable housing and homelessness and how some of these tenant protection acts and the ways of gentrification and demolition of buildings and people losing the rights to live in the places they live. Briefly, do you have like a 1-minute summary or thoughts on this?
So there is a section of the bill where the ministers give himself the right to write regulations in the future about demolition control. What's demolition control? If you've got if the municipality passes a policy to this effect, we can say you need a permit to knock down a building. And municipalities have started putting some rules around that to try to protect the level of affordability that exists in an existing building. So we have in Waterloo a place where there's a 3-story 1970s apartment. The rents were still mostly affordable. The building probably needed a lot of work, but it's being knocked down in favor of a larger structure. And so everybody got kicked out. We didn't have any existing rules in place, but we're in the process of bringing in rules, just like Toronto's had, around maintaining affordability for existing tenants and a right of return. Or a reasonable other location at a reasonable price that's similar to what they're paying now in a new building. Steve Clark says, oh, I don't know, that looks like it's going to impede rental housing. We need to kill existing rental housing to build more rental housing. That'll be more expensive and kick out the people that are relying on low rent. So municipalities have been hearing that call. Hamilton was the first. Toronto has some stuff. We're working through some stuff to try to protect that level of affordability for existing tenants while allowing intensification. But Steve Clark is giving himself the right to write rules to tell us we can't do that. Or not, or something, but we don't know because they don't tell us yet. But that could be on the chopping block. So that's the most promising avenue we've had to go after sort of affordability maintained through sort of demolition and intensification. And they're trying to take that away because it might mean less stuff gets built. Sure, but it also eliminates a way to protect affordable housing.
Steph, just before you go on to more questions from the chat, we have Gail and Kay that are asking questions.
Yes, I was just about to go on to them. I think it was Gail, you were first. What would you like to ask? You can turn your video on or off, or what do you like to do?
Hi, I really appreciate both of you, Gabby and Jeff, because I'm not experienced in this like you are. Quick question, and please excuse its basic what I'm lacking. Jeff, are the developers really losing money in what has been proposed to them in the regional official plan that was okayed last summer? Like, are they? Is that too much to answer?
So let me see if I can be short on this. If you speculated that land outside the urban boundary would move inside the urban boundary, so you'd be allowed to build a bunch of homes on it. If you bet the farm, so to speak, and now you haven't been allowed to build on farmland because, we don't actually need that land to accommodate people, you're not happy. Those people are very vocal. And, if you speculate on land, you want it to pay off. So I don't know if they're losing their shirt or not, or if they're just going to wait. I can't speculate on that. In terms of the folks that are sort of in the intensification area, they're not going to lose their shirt either off of these because they're simply not going to go ahead with the development that doesn't make money when they're doing it because their bank won't fund it, right? To be able to build a building, that's a huge outlay of money. Somebody's got to do some construction financing loan. And you're not going to get a loan unless you're showing a 10% return on your project, because that gives you a buffer for when things go wrong. So you still make some money and can pay the bank back, right? So you make 2% or 3% when things go wrong, bank still gets paid, everybody's happy. So they just don't go ahead. And we're seeing some of those projects stall out because their math has stopped working for a variety of reasons: construction costs, labor costs. The prices are going up for how much it costs to build, while the amount they can charge goes down given the market adjustments and interest rates. And once this line crosses that line, well, they just stop. If they're not already building, if they don't have a construction loan, they just stop. So they don't lose money. They wait. They wait until things right, and then they'll go.
So
basic math is more complicated than that, but that's the simple math on sort of development.
Thank you very much. The article in the Record yesterday, did you see that? Okay, and just to say what I'm asking about is they're saying that housing is very profitable for local, provincial, and federal governments, and they have attacked it as a revenue source, and that the poor developers are getting attacked.
Yeah, well, I think this is where people in the private sector can think that the public sector is just like them, and that every fee charge is about making a return for their shareholders so that they can, I don't know, do shareholder buybacks or dividends or something. We're non-profit corporations. Ain't nobody getting a dividend out of these things, right? There's no income stream for this. The money collected from municipal fees goes to pay, if it's development charges, for the infrastructure to support growth, if it's parkland, to be able to acquire new parks. So those residents they're selling a great lifestyle to have a place to go outside and enjoy, or a community center. It's on their billboards and their machines, but if we don't have the fees, we can't build it for it. Or if there's sort of planning fees for review of sort of whether it's a site plan fee or a development or a sort of zone change fee, that's charges so that we can pay planning staff to make sure it gets a proper review And in Waterloo, the way we set those fees is at about 50% of the real cost of doing it, because there's a private benefit to us processing the application and a public benefit to sort of housing for growth and community benefits. So we recover about half of the fees through those sort of development fees from the proponent, and the rest is sort of on the property tax base, because there is a community benefit to being able to accommodate growth. And each municipality will set that budget differently. So those monies are accounted for to do things that developers want us to do and sell their future residents on us doing. If I were to equate their sort of, well, we only make 10 to 12%, but look at all this money that they're making. Well, I would turn that math around on them and saying, if you're selling 100 units at 500,000 a unit, well, the way you do your math, I'd say that's $50 million in your pocket. But it's not, because that's just the gross revenue. Then you got to spend all the money. And so when you spend all the money that we collect, it's all gone. Dollar in, dollar out.
Gail, is that you're good to move on? Yeah, you're muted, but I'm assuming it's okay.
It's good. It's great. Thank you.
Thank you. Kay, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, I just wanted you to talk, Jeff, more about the building code and how we can influence that, and what's the process? Is it kind of outside the political process, or?
No, it's a good question. It's like building code's not the greatest, sexiest thing in the world, honestly. It's not.
I know, but
people engaged on building code. Yeah, that's super exciting. Let's do that.
But how do we do that?
Yeah, I did put a link in there just kind of explaining about the importance of the Ontario Building Code. One of the rationales we've been using to advance green standards and putting energy and efficiency metrics within green development standards is the fact that when the province sets the Ontario Building Code, they have to take the whole province into consideration. And there's different market capabilities and supply chain issues, or, there might be some differences and nuances. North Bay might be a very different market from Waterloo region or Wellington region. Timmins might be a very different one. So that's one of the values associated with green development standards, is municipalities now have authorities that they can work at a much smaller geographical scale and help the market move towards and advance this innovation, build capacity in the labor market, bring the supplies that they are needed to be able to advance net zero towards net zero emission buildings into Ontario to reduce costs. That's part of this market transformation effort to better enable Ontario as a whole to be able to make improvements on the Ontario Building Code requirements. That's been one of the things in the rationales for the value of green development standards. But ultimately, as part of this, it would be if the Ontario Building Code could really kind of follow exactly along the lines of the Toronto Green Standard, or the Whitby Green Standard, or the BC Step Code, or the National Model Building Code now. That is the direction that we all need to be heading. How fast we do it is the faster we can do it, the less homes are going to have to be retrofitted 10 to 15 years from now. And that's a big, huge saving on any of these people who are owning these properties that would have been so much better to have built right from the beginning. And it's cheaper to do it that way too. So I think that's one of the areas. And we did kind of give some highlight. There's some sample resolutions in that URL I put. One of them is from the Waterloo region. So you can kind of steal. This is all for stealing. Steal, take away, use as many times as you possibly can. Taking some of that messaging and sending that to Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing. That's the provincial jurisdiction for the Ontario Building Code. It's under review right now. If it passes the way it's been proposed, it will mean that the Ontario Building Code will not have increased its energy efficiency requirements for a decade in Ontario. So that's not really moving the market. And that's not meeting the goals associated with what an Ontario Building Code can and needs to do to be able to move us all towards the net zero emission buildings that we all need, and new buildings need to get there as quickly as possible. And that's an affordability over the lifetime of that building, because it all includes lower operational costs.
Well, you just dashed my hopes completely when you told me it was Steve Clark that will. Does that mean Steve Clark will ultimately decide that, or is there any way to do an end run? I know Jeff tried to do, we did a resolution here, but what? And Jeff, maybe you can, or either of you, like, what are ways to influence that happening? Are there any outside of?
Well,
I just want to, Jeff,
say,
I just want to jump in. I want to make sure we're sticking with Bill 23.
Yeah. Well, and this is like, if the government is going to legislate away the ability for municipalities to piecemeal create energy efficiency standards, green development standards, any label you want to give them, that are above the Ontario Building Code, because they're worried about all this stuff going on across the province. Well, having one code that meets the needs of the climate in the moment is the right way to do it, right? It's a way to sort of say, if you want to do this because you're worried about it, fine, fix it over here, right? And that's part of the advocacy. If you can't get rid of the bill, what do you do that can at least help on this? And I'd say the messaging that I would use has evolved over the summer. The government, both provincial and federal, have been together on a spending spree of investing in positioning Ontario to be a leader in the green economy of the future, in terms of batteries, in terms of EV supply chain, in terms of some of the investments in sort of greener cement and greener steel and greener, like they're doing all those types of investments. And they're also focused on, oh, those pesky people that only like universities, what about all those building trades? Well, this is a tailor-made solution for a green economy with good local trades jobs all across the province, in small towns and communities, from Timmins to Temiskaming and all the way down to Thorold, to be able to do those great jobs and live up to those new standards, and really be able to solve their energy and electricity problem that they're facing through energy efficiency standards with buildings, while creating new trades and new jobs. Right? I think there's an angle there that they've been selling, that there's a new message to sort of underline why this would help. And the step code is a step way to get there. And the feds have laid out a path, and BC's laid out a path. Just do it. Just do that. If you don't want to raise it this year, say that it'll be up in 2 years' time. Give us a ladder. Let industry catch up. Let the trades catch up. Let Monty McNaughton's plan for labor really take effect. And I think there's an opportunity there in alignment with the government's existing messaging around that.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Okay, I want to make sure we're already a little bit behind on schedule here. So I'm going to pop open a poll for everyone here. And I would like people to comment on which topics are they most concerned about, based on information they've learned tonight and maybe information they've heard elsewhere. But if everyone can kind of select, and you can select more than one. So as we talk about this, was the loss of, and anyone else, while we're doing this poll, I'm sure there's other experts here at this event. So if there is anyone who wants to jump in and explain a bit more, I am just a volunteer. I am just a citizen that's read the bill a lot and talked to a lot of people. I am not an expert on this or a lawyer. So we heard from Phil about the loss of protection for wetlands and farmlands and woodlots, as well as we heard from Gabby about the loss of green development standards. We also heard about the limiting ability of municipalities to reach their climate goals. From Phil, we heard about the conservation authorities' loss of power and what would that mean. And that's part of the site control, and also looking at overall what conservation authorities will be allowed to do from now on, or how they'll be able to be involved. Affordable housing, we didn't really talk about it. We kind of did, but we didn't. So there's the loss of development fees that normally go towards services and programs for developments. At a meeting I was at, I think it was Monday, I can't remember anymore. Someone was saying that, oh no, it's Tuesday, Toronto will be losing out around $200 million a year from these development fees that normally go towards affordable housing services and programs. Someone else mentioned $10 million over a slot of time in a different location. Again, this money's already been allocated towards programs and services. There's already assumption that these programs will continue. Development fees getting cut. Where is that money going to be coming from next? As well as the problem with affordable housing with the Tenancy Act, like Jeff was talking about, was the demolition of properties and some municipalities being able to protect tenants. And making sure that developers give space to them when they rebuild their properties, as well as we didn't really talk about the restriction access to Ontario Land Tribunal. the increased rejection rate, as well as who is actually allowed to go to the Ontario Land Tribunal. Something about third parties, Jeff, do you know more about that? How there'll be a limit of who actually can bring things to the Ontario Land Tribunal, that you have to be directly related with the project, the problem. And then the last one is just about law issue with civil liberties and the undemocratic way this bill's been moving forward in between elections, the day after the municipal election, as well as how fast this has been expedited, announced on the 25th. Second reading was on the Monday, with very little input or knowledge from anyone. And because the Conservatives have a major majority, they're able to steamroll this now, and it's going into committee. And it's already passed first reading and second reading with no quorums whatsoever into committee. And now we have no clue how fast this can be moving forward. Does anyone have anything to say about this as we're kind of people picking their topics? Go ahead, Gabby. Oh, you're muted.
Someone had to do it, eh? I wanted to wait and see if anyone actually wanted to kind of raise it, but one of the conversations I wanted to talk about was the conservation authorities and the significant wetlands and what that really means. Like, honestly, that to me is like, I never saw it. Like, I did not think that is like bold, man. Like, that's like taking a sledgehammer to the wetland authorities on this one. And what they're really saying on this one is that all of the provincially significant wetlands, as they are termed right now, is no longer like, you now have to prove you are a provincially significant wetland. And not only do you have to prove that you're a significantly, a provincially significant wetland, you need to do it alone. Just you, little wetland, prove your value to retain yourself. But wetlands don't work that way. Wetlands work in a system being able to support each other. One wetland won't be able to make a difference to your stormwater fees. They won't make a difference to your stormwater system, but a series of wetlands working together as a system can make a significant reduction in your stormwater management costs associated with that. It makes a huge difference in terms of the flood risk associated with it. The part that I'm kind of mind blown on this one is like, well, they're a wetland for a reason. That means that they've got high groundwater levels. So what kind of infrastructure and costs are going to be associated with removing that groundwater on an ongoing basis? Because it's not like you just remove groundwater once and it's fine, like, oh, I'm going to go somewhere else now. No, it's going to come back. And that's the wetland for a reason. It's a wetland. It's just, sometimes you're thinking about this. But one of the things I think that's so important on this one, and I don't know what kind of ability there is to make changes on this big, huge omnibus bill, but this is not the end of it. This is what democracy and citizen engagement is all about. They're right now pushing this through, thinking other people are worried about other things, and the protest and resistance to this is going to die down on this one. But ultimately, what it comes down to it is they're a wetland, they're a flood risk. Who's going to be building on that? What kind of infrastructure? What kind of insurance companies are going to want to insure that property? All of this needs transparency. This is increasing the flood risk and the flood cost across Ontario. We need transparency on where these wetlands are no longer going to be protected, and what kind of development is taking place on that, and who is that development for, and what is that development to, like, all of those things on transparency. I keep thinking, like, in the evaluation work we did on the collective Ontario, we did on the growth plan, it wasn't the province who did the growth plan evaluation. It was Neptus Foundation that did all of this evaluation work and helped to identify what was working about the growth plan, what wasn't working about the growth plan. All of that work was done by the Neptus Foundation, and this transparency is absolutely critical moving forward. Because if we don't have that, not only will the wetlands not be saved, but they'll never come back, but it also means that this is emboldened this kind of land grab. I don't know what else to say. Sorry, I will shut up now.
Thanks, Gabby. I loved it. Loved it. You know, I'd have to tell you that there's so many video clips I saw there. Sorry, Gabby. I'll get your approval first before I start doing these memes and video clips of you. But we're going to go into breakout rooms now. To allow people to talk about what do some of these topics mean to them, and what are some things we can move forward with for action items. So I don't know who is going to be able to take notes, but when you get dumped, when you pick a room and there's people in it, when you guys got to take notes and bring it back, because the notes are extremely important when we're talking about mobilization. Is there anything that someone wants to mention? I noticed that someone else said, there's something about Heritage Act, or is there anyone that want to mention anything before we go into these breakout rooms?